I got home early from work that day. One of those rare occasions where everything at the office wrapped up faster than expected. Normally, I'd shoot Karen a text when I was heading home, but this time I figured I'd surprise her. I walked in through the front door, tossing my keys onto the small table by the entrance. The house was quieter than usual, which was strange because Karen was a big fan of blasting music when she was home alone. I noticed her car was in the driveway, so she had to be around somewhere. As I passed through the hallway, I caught a whiff of something familiar, Karen's perfume, the one I'd given her last Christmas. It wasn't just a light scent either. It was strong, like she'd just put it on. I figured maybe she was upstairs getting ready to head out somewhere. It crossed my mind that maybe she had plans she hadn't mentioned, but it wasn't like her to keep me out of the loop. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way up. I stopped halfway when I heard a sound coming from the bedroom. It was faint but unmistakable, the low murmur of voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but one voice was definitely Karen's. The other. I wasn't sure, but it definitely wasn't someone I recognized. I stood there for a moment, trying to piece it together. Was she on a call? Maybe she was talking to a friend or something. But as I took another step closer, the voices became clearer. They weren't just talking. There was a certain tone in the conversation that didn't sit right with me. I knew something was off, but I couldn't quite bring myself to believe it. When I reached the top of the stairs, the door to our bedroom was slightly ajar. I walked toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last. I could hear her laughter, light and flirty, the kind I hadn't heard from her in a while. Then a man's voice, low and hushed, followed by more laughter. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw them. Karen was sitting on the bed wearing nothing but her robe, the one I had seen her in 1,000 times before. Next to her, a man I didn't recognize, shirtless, with his hand resting on her thigh. They both froze when they saw me, like deer caught in headlights. The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Karen's eyes were wide with shock, her face pale as if all the blood had drained out of it. The guy, on the other hand, didn't move, didn't say a word. Just stared at me like he was waiting for something, maybe a reaction. But I didn't give him one. Instead, I just stood there, taking in the scene. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I kept it in check. I wasn't about to lose my cool. Not yet. Karen finally broke the silence, stammering something incoherent, but I didn't listen. I turned around and walked out, leaving the door wide open behind me. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get out of there. I stepped out of the house, the door slamming shut behind me, and headed straight to the car. I sat in the car trying to get a grip on what I'd just seen. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel, but I wasn't going anywhere. I was too stunned, too confused, trying to piece together the mess in my head. Then my phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping me out of it. It was a text from Karen. "Hey, I'm thinking we should have something sweet for dinner tonight. What do you think?" I stared at the screen, my mind doing somersaults. Sweet for dinner? How could she act like nothing was wrong, like I hadn't just caught her with another man? The casualness of the message threw me off completely. I didn't know, and honestly, I couldn't even begin to guess what was going through her mind. But I sure as hell wasn't going to respond. I tossed the phone back onto the seat without replying. A few minutes passed and the phone buzzed again. Another message from Karen. "Are you busy now?" Busy? The nerve of her, I couldn't believe it. She was acting like everything was normal, like she hadn't just been caught red-handed. My anger flared up again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to play into whatever game she was trying to run here. Then, the phone started ringing. Karen was calling. I let it ring for a few seconds, debating whether to pick up or just let it go to voicemail. But I knew I had to face this sooner or later, so I grabbed the phone and answered. "Why are you ignoring me?" Karen's voice came through the line, sounding almost playful, like she had no idea what was going on. That pushed me over the edge. "Are you kidding me?" I snapped, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. There was a pause on the other end. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her tone had changed. There was a hint of confusion, or maybe it was fear. I couldn't tell, and I didn't care. "I saw you, Karen. I saw you with that guy in our bed," I said, my words sharp, each one cutting deeper as I spoke. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, then she finally spoke up, but her voice was different now. Calm, too calm. "What are you talking about? I'm not even home yet," she said, as if that was supposed to clear everything up. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. "I was there, Karen. I walked in and saw you," I replied, my patience running thin. Another pause, longer this time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was tight, like she was struggling to keep it together. "You must be confused. I'm still at work. I haven't been home since this morning." That threw me for a loop. What the hell was she trying to pull? But before I could say anything, she continued, her voice shaking just a little. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but it wasn't me. You must have seen something else." I could hear her trying to sound convincing, but the doubt was already there. I didn't know what game she was playing, but I wasn't about to let her gaslight me into thinking I'd imagined the whole thing. I was standing in that doorway, staring right at her, and I wasn't about to forget it. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but I'm not buying it," I said, my voice cold. "We'll talk when you get home." I hung up before she could say anything else, throwing the phone onto the seat. I wasn't going to let her twist this around on me. She could play innocent all she wanted, but I knew what I saw. I drove around for a while, trying to burn off the tension in my chest. I didn't need to think. I knew what I'd seen, and that was enough. But sitting in that car wasn't doing me any good, so I headed back home. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky as I pulled into the driveway. Karen's car was still there, but the house was quiet when I walked inside. I stepped into the living room, the emptiness of the place almost mocking. There was no sign of her, and the silence felt heavy, almost like it was waiting for something. I checked the bedroom, empty. The bed looked like it hadn't been touched since I'd left. I stood there for a moment, taking it in. The sheets were neatly made, everything in place, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. I headed back downstairs and decided to wait. Karen had said she was at work, but I knew that was a lie. I didn't have to wait long before I heard the front door open. Karen walked in, dressed in her usual work clothes, looking as put together as ever. She froze when she saw me standing in the middle of the living room, her eyes widening just a bit. "You're back," she said, forcing a smile. "I was just about to call you again." I didn't respond, just watched her as she slipped off her shoes and hung up her coat, acting like nothing was wrong. She walked over, still smiling, but there was something off about it. Too much effort behind it. "I don't know what's going on with you today," she started, her voice steady, "but I've been at work all day. I don't know who you think you saw, but it wasn't me." She met my eyes, trying to sell the lie, but it wasn't sticking. I didn't say anything, just let her words hang in the air. She was good, too good at keeping it together, but I wasn't about to let her twist this around, not after what I saw. She moved closer, reaching out to touch my arm, but I stepped back, keeping the distance between us. Her hand dropped, and for a split second I saw something flash in her eyes, something she quickly hid behind that calm facade. "I'm telling you the truth," she insisted, her voice firm. "You must have seen someone else. I don't know who, but it wasn't me." I just stood there, letting her talk. I wasn't going to argue or get into a back and forth. I knew what I needed to do, and it didn't involve getting dragged into her web of lies. Karen kept talking, trying to smooth things over, but I wasn't listening anymore. Finally, she stopped, waiting for me to say something. But I had nothing to say. Not yet. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, still trying to hold on to whatever story she'd come up with. Karen showed up about an hour later, just as I was sitting in the living room, replaying everything in my head. She walked in dressed in her usual work clothes, looking calm like she hadn't a care in the world. As soon as she saw me, her face lit up with that same smile I'd seen 1,000 times. She casually slipped off her shoes and hung up her coat, all the while pretending everything was normal. She started with the excuses immediately, saying she had been at work all day, claiming she didn't know who I thought I'd seen, but it definitely wasn't her. She tried to approach me, even reached out like she wanted to close the gap between us. I stepped back. I wasn't interested in playing this game, and she knew it. She kept talking, sticking to her story, trying to make me doubt what I'd seen. But I wasn't buying any of it. I didn't bother arguing. I just turned around and headed upstairs. I wasn't going to waste time listening to any more of her lies. I had seen enough. The next morning, Karen was already up when I came downstairs. She was making coffee like it was just another day. I could tell she was waiting for me, probably planning to keep the act going. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, she started up again with the same story from the night before. She insisted that she had been at work all day yesterday, saying she never left the office. Her voice was steady, like she had rehearsed every word. She even suggested that I go down to the security office at her workplace to check the cameras. She said if I did, I'd see for myself that she hadn't left her desk the entire time. It was a bold move, and she delivered it with confidence, like she had nothing to hide. It wasn't like I had a better plan, so I decided to take her up on it. I didn't say much to her, just nodded, grabbed my keys, and left the house. Karen didn't try to stop me or say anything else, which only added to my confusion. If she was lying, she was doing it with a level of conviction that was hard to shake. I drove to her office, the tension building with every mile. It was the middle of the morning by the time I got there. The security office was tucked away in a back corner of the building, not a place I'd ever thought I'd visit. But here I was asking the guy behind the desk if he could show me the footage from the previous day. The security guard didn't ask many questions, just grunted and started pulling up the tapes. I stood there watching as he fast-forwarded through the hours of footage. There was Karen sitting at her desk, typing away at her computer, answering calls, even taking a lunch break in the cafeteria downstairs. I kept waiting for something to happen, for her to get up and leave, but she never did. The clock on the screen kept moving forward, and she stayed at her desk the entire time. By the time the footage reached the end of the day, she was still there, packing up her things before heading out of the office. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She had been at work the whole day, just like she said. There was no denying it. I left the security office, my mind spinning. If she had been at work all day, then who the hell was in our bedroom yesterday? I drove back home, the whole thing replaying in my head over and over. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Everything I had seen with my own eyes was now in question. When I walked back into the house, Karen was sitting in the living room waiting for me. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with that same calm expression she'd had all morning. It was like she knew what I had found out and was waiting for me to acknowledge it. "Well?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. There was no trace of worry in her voice, just a quiet confidence that unnerved me even more. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to say. I was left standing there, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. All I could do was nod, acknowledging that she had been telling the truth, at least about being at work. But that didn't solve anything. If she wasn't the one in the house yesterday, then who was? And why did it look so much like her? The questions were piling up, but I had no answers, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was back at square one, with no idea what to believe anymore. I needed to clear my head after what I saw on those security tapes. I called up my brother Mike and asked if he wanted to grab a drink. He didn't ask any questions, just told me to meet him at our usual spot, a small bar on the edge of town where we'd hung out for years. When I got there, Mike was already sitting at the bar, nursing a beer. I slid onto the stool next to him and he gave me a once-over, clearly picking up on the fact that something was wrong. "Rough day?" he asked, sliding a fresh beer in my direction. "You could say that," I replied, taking a long swig. I wasn't sure where to start, but I knew I had to tell someone. Mike was one of the people I trusted to help me figure this out. I laid it all out for him, walking in on Karen with that guy, her denying it, then going to her office and seeing the security footage that showed she was there all day. As I talked, Mike listened quietly, his face growing more serious with every detail. When I finished, he leaned back, rubbing his jaw like he was trying to piece it together. "Man, that's wild. You're sure you saw her with that guy?" "I know what I saw," I said firmly. "She was there, Mike. I walked in and she was sitting on our bed with him, plain as day." He nodded slowly, still thinking it over. "But then you see the footage and she's at work all day. That's the part that doesn't add up. You've been working a lot lately, right? Maybe you were just wiped and your mind played tricks on you." I shook my head. I thought about that, but no. This wasn't a dream, Mike. It was real as sitting here with you right now. Mike didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Okay, so if it wasn't a dream, then I don't know what to tell you, man. Maybe, I don't know, maybe someone was messing with you, but who'd go to all that trouble? I took another drink, letting his words sink in. It was frustrating not having any clear answers. I wish I knew, but if something like this happens again, I'm not leaving the house. I've got to figure out what's really going on. Mike nodded, his expression serious. Yeah, you can't just walk away if it happens again. You need to stay put, get to the bottom of it. But honestly, I hope it doesn't come to that. Me too, I said quietly, the unease settling deeper into my gut. We didn't talk much after that, just sat there, drinking in silence. Mike didn't push any more theories or try to reassure me. He knew there wasn't much he could say that would make this situation any easier. When we finished our beers, we said our goodbyes and I headed back home feeling more lost than before. Mike's advice to stay put if anything happened again was solid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go down. As I drove through the dimly lit streets on the way back home, I spotted a couple walking along the side of the road. At first glance, I thought nothing of it, but as I got closer, something about the guy caught my eye. He looked familiar, too familiar. It was the same man I had seen in my house with Karen. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled over and jumped out of the car, running toward them. As I got closer, I yelled out, demanding they stop. The couple turned to face me, and that's when I realized the woman wasn't Karen, but her friend Rachel, who looked a lot like her. The resemblance was uncanny, and it threw me off for a second. But the guy? No doubt about it, he was the same one I'd seen sitting on my bed with Karen. I marched right up to him, ignoring Rachel's confused expression. I didn't care about her at that moment. I stared the guy down, my voice low and firm as I said, I know who you are and I know what you've been doing. You were in my house yesterday with my wife. He started to stammer, trying to deny it, but I wasn't having any of it. Don't even think about lying, I snapped. I know what I saw, and if you don't start talking, I'll call the cops right now and report you for trespassing. That got his attention. His face went pale, and he glanced nervously at Rachel, who was now looking more worried than confused. Realizing he was cornered, he finally spilled the truth. He admitted that he was seeing both Karen and Rachel, but things got complicated when he had no place to take Rachel. He didn't want to spend money on a hotel room, so he used my house instead, with Karen's full knowledge and even her permission. Apparently, Karen had given him a key, trusting him enough to let him bring Rachel there. Hearing this was like a punch to the gut. So Karen really was cheating on me. And not just with one guy, but she was also helping him cheat with someone else in our own house. My head was spinning with anger and betrayal, but I kept it together. I wasn't about to lose it in the middle of the street. So she is cheating on me after all, I said, more to myself than to him. I knew I had to play this smart. There was no way I was letting Karen get away with this, but I needed proof, something undeniable. I turned back to the guy, my voice cold. Here's what's going to happen. The next time you're planning to meet up with Karen, you're going to call me first. You'll take her back to our house and I'll walk in on you too. If you try to back out or warn her, I'll make sure both of you regret it. Do you understand? He was terrified at this point, nodding quickly. He wasn't about to risk crossing me. I pulled out my phone and he gave me his number. He wasn't happy about it, but he knew he didn't have a choice. With that, I turned and walked back to my car, leaving him and Rachel standing there. I didn't look back. The ball was in my court now, and I was going to make sure I caught Karen in the act. I waited those few days on edge, knowing that sooner or later, I'd get that call. When it finally came, it was late afternoon. I was at work trying to keep myself busy, but my mind was anywhere but the office. The phone buzzed on my desk, and I saw the number flash across the screen. It was him. He sounded nervous, like he knew he was crossing a line he shouldn't, but he told me straight out that Karen and he had planned to meet up that evening. They'd be at my house around 6, expecting me to still be at work. I kept my voice steady, told him I'd be there, and ended the call. He didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any answers. I made up an excuse to leave work early, telling my boss that something urgent had come up. It wasn't like me to leave before the end of the day, so I knew I'd need a good reason, but I wasn't about to let this chance slip by. The drive home felt longer than usual, each mile dragging on as I played out different scenarios in my head. I parked a few blocks away from the house, making sure I wouldn't be seen. I sat in the car, watching the minutes tick by on the dashboard. Every sound outside made me tense up, but I stayed focused. Just before 6, a car pulled up to my driveway. My heart pounded as I saw Karen step out of the passenger side, the guy following right behind her. They didn't waste any time, heading straight for the front door. Karen looked around, checking that the coast was clear, before unlocking the door and stepping inside. Once they were in, I moved quickly. I knew they'd expect me to be at work, so I had the element of surprise. I crept up to the house, sticking close to the walls, and made my way to the side window. From there, I could see into the living room. Karen was already on the couch, her shoes kicked off, jacket draped over the armrest. She looked comfortable, like she'd done this 100 times before. The guy was pacing nervously, clearly on edge. I crouched down by the window, watching as they talked. Karen seemed at ease, laughing at something he said, while he kept glancing around, like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. I wanted to catch them off guard, and I knew just how to do it. I walked to the front door and stepped inside. The sound of the door opening made them both freeze. Karen's smile disappeared as soon as she saw me standing there. Her eyes went wide, panic flashing across her face. The guy looked like he was ready to bolt, but he didn't move. "What the hell are you doing here?" Karen demanded, trying to sound in control, but I could hear the fear in her voice. She was scrambling to make sense of what was happening, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. I walked straight toward the guy, ignoring Karen's questions. I asked him how long this had been going on, how long he'd been sneaking into my house thinking he could get away with it. Karen tried to cut in, saying something about how I didn't understand, but I wasn't listening. I kept my focus on him. He was the weak link, and I knew if I pushed hard enough, he'd crack. He tried to deny it at first, saying it wasn't what it looked like, but I wasn't buying it. I told him he had 2 choices: tell me the truth or deal with the cops. I made it clear that I wasn't bluffing. I'd have him arrested for trespassing and whatever else I could think of if he didn't start talking. That did the trick. He started spilling everything, clearly terrified of what might happen next. He admitted that he'd been seeing Karen for a while, sneaking around behind my back. He also confessed that Karen had given him a key to the house, trusting him enough to let him come and go as he pleased. But what really set me off was when he admitted that Karen wasn't the only one. He'd been seeing Rachel too, and when they didn't have anywhere else to go, they'd use my house. He said they hadn't meant to disrespect me, that it was just convenient, but his words only fueled my anger. Karen sat there in silence, her face pale as he talked. She knew there was no way out now, no way to explain this away. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she knew it. I didn't let Karen interrupt. She was clearly in shock, realizing that everything was unraveling. She had nothing to say that could fix this, and she knew it. The guy tried to defend himself weakly, saying that he hadn't meant for things to get so out of hand, that it was just supposed to be a fling. But his excuses only made me angrier. After getting everything out of that guy, I was done. The anger had built up to a point where I knew I needed to act, not just stand there and let them squirm. I pointed at the door and told him to get out. He hesitated for a moment, probably trying to figure out if I was serious, but I made it clear I wasn't playing around. "Go have fun with Rachel," I said coldly. "At least she's not married." He didn't need any more convincing. He scrambled to his feet and bolted for the door. I watched him go, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing through the house. Good riddance. With him gone, I turned to Karen. She was still sitting there, looking stunned, like she couldn't believe this was happening. I didn't give her a chance to speak. I walked right up to her, standing over her as she looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "You're leaving," I said, my voice flat, no room for argument. "Get out of the house, right now." She started to protest, trying to plead with me. She said she didn't have anywhere to go, that we needed to talk this through. But I wasn't interested in hearing anything she had to say. I cut her off, repeating myself, louder this time. "Get out, now." There was a moment where she looked like she might try to push back, But then she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. Her shoulders slumped in defeat and she got up from the couch. She grabbed her jacket, moving slowly like she was hoping I'd soften up if she took her time. I didn't. I just stood there watching her every move, making sure she knew this wasn't negotiable. She tried one last time, her voice shaky, asking if she could at least stay until morning. I didn't budge. No, leave now. Realizing she had no choice, she nodded weakly and headed for the door. She opened it, hesitated for a second like she was going to say something, but then thought better of it. She stepped out and the door closed behind her, leaving me standing alone in the house that suddenly felt a lot quieter. The next morning I didn't waste any time. I got up early, made a few calls, and by mid-morning I was at the courthouse, filing for divorce. There was no way back from this. Karen had made her choice and I had made mine. The anger hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only gotten stronger. Kicking Karen out and filing those papers felt like a start, but it wasn't enough. I needed to do something more, something that would leave a mark. I wanted her to feel the same betrayal, the same pain that she'd put me through. But it couldn't be something ordinary. It had to be something that would hit her where it hurt the most. I spent the rest of the day thinking about how to make it happen. I considered all the usual forms of revenge, but none of them seemed right. Cutting off her finances, bad-mouthing her to our mutual friends, exposing her affair. Those were things she might expect. They'd hurt, sure, but they wouldn't be enough. I needed something that would get under her skin, something that would linger long after the divorce was finalized. And then it hit me. Karen was always obsessed with appearances. How she looked, how our life looked to others, how everything seemed perfect on the outside. She had always been meticulous about maintaining that image, no matter what was really going on behind closed doors. That was her weak spot, her Achilles heel. If I could shatter that illusion, it would devastate her. I started planning. I knew I needed to be careful to make sure everything was done right. The last thing I wanted was for this to backfire. It had to be precise, deliberate, and most importantly, it had to be public. Karen thrived on social media. Facebook, Instagram, whatever the latest platform was, she was on it, curating every post to present the perfect life. I decided that's where I'd strike. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could find. Texts, photos, anything that would paint the true picture of what our marriage had become. I knew where Karen kept her old phone, the one she used before upgrading. She had never bothered to wipe it, so I had access to years of messages, photos, and even old social media accounts she no longer used. I found enough to paint a vivid picture of her affairs, her lies, and all the little details she'd tried so hard to hide. But that was just the beginning. I started crafting a narrative, one that would lay everything out in the open. I created a new social media account, one that looked like any other normal, personal account. I made sure it was untraceable, using a fake name and all the necessary precautions to keep it anonymous. Then I began to post. It started slow, a few cryptic messages, a couple of photos that only hinted at what was to come. I knew Karen and her friends would notice. They'd wonder who this account belonged to, what these posts meant, and as they speculated, I'd be building toward the grand reveal. Every day I added more, old photos of Karen and me. Texts between her and that guy, snippets of conversations she'd had with Rachel and others. I knew exactly how to present it, how to make it look like a puzzle that needed solving. I knew Karen's friends would start connecting the dots, and soon enough they'd realize who the posts were about. The final piece was a video. I had pieced it together from various clips I found on her old phone, snippets of her talking to her lovers, moments where she thought she was safe, where she didn't have to put on her perfect act. It wasn't explicit, but it was damning. It showed the real Karen, the one who lied, cheated, and betrayed the people closest to her. I made sure it was edited just right. With a voiceover I recorded myself, explaining everything, exposing every dirty secret she had tried to hide. I waited until the account had gained enough attention. People were already talking about it, trying to figure out who was behind it, who it was targeting. Then, on a Friday evening, when I knew Karen would be out with friends, I posted the video. I made sure it was set to go live across all the platforms she used, tagging her, her friends, and even some of her colleagues. I imagined her phone lighting up with notifications as she sat there, surrounded by the people who thought they knew her. I pictured the looks on their faces as they watched the video, realizing what kind of person she really was. I knew it would spread like wildfire, that by the end of the night, everyone in her social circle would have seen it. I spent that evening alone in the house, waiting for the fallout. I knew Karen would try to contact me, to scream at me, to beg me to take it down, but I didn't care. I turned off my phone, unplugged the landline, and just waited, imagining the chaos I had unleashed. The next morning, I turned my phone back on. There were dozens of missed calls, texts, voicemails, all from Karen. I didn't bother listening to them. I didn't need to. I could guess exactly what she was saying, but none of it mattered. The damage was done. I checked the account I had created. The video had been shared hundreds of times. The comments were piling up and people were tearing her apart. There was no way to put it back together. I knew she'd never recover from this. She might try, but the people around her would never see her the same way again. By the afternoon, Karen showed up at the house. She pounded on the door, yelling for me to let her in, demanding to know why I had done it. I watched her from the window, calm and detached, knowing that I had finally gotten my revenge. After a while, she gave up and left, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I had taken everything from her, the life she had carefully crafted, the lies she had told, the people she had manipulated. It was all laid bare for the world to see, and there was no way she could escape it. For the first time since this all began, I felt like I was in control again. The divorce went through without a hitch. Karen didn't contest it. She didn't have the energy or the will to fight after what I had done. We divided the assets and I let her keep more than she deserved. I didn't need the money or the house. I had already taken what I wanted, her reputation, her image, her entire facade. In the end, I moved out of the house, leaving it behind along with all the memories. I started fresh, in a new place with a clean slate. Karen, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of the life I had destroyed. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that I had won, and that was enough. Months later, I heard through the grapevine that Karen had moved away, trying to start over somewhere new, where people didn't know her story. But I also knew that no matter where she went, she'd never escape what I had done. Her past would always follow her, and she'd always be looking over her shoulder, wondering if someone else might dig up the truth. As for me, I moved on. The revenge had been sweet, but I didn't let it define me. I had done what I needed to do, and now it was time to live my life on my own terms, without the weight of betrayal hanging over me. And in the quiet moments, when I thought back to everything that had happened, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that I had taken control of my life in a way that no one could ever take from me. Life in the quiet Arkansas countryside had been exactly what I needed. After everything with Karen, I'd packed up and left the city behind, settling into a small country house owned by my uncle. He was getting on in years and needed someone around to help him with the day-to-day stuff. So it was a good arrangement. The place was simple but comfortable, surrounded by fields and woods, the kind of peace I hadn't realized I was missing until I was here. I thought the whole mess with Karen was finally over. The divorce had gone through and I'd cut ties with everything and everyone from that chapter of my life. I was finally starting to feel like myself again, enjoying the clear air, the long walks, and the quiet nights where the only sounds were crickets and the occasional owl. But about a month ago, I got a call that I never expected. Rachel's name flashed on my phone screen, and it took me a second to even remember who she was. I hadn't saved her number, but I figured she must have saved mine back when we were all pretending to be one big happy group of friends, planning surprises for Karen's birthdays and other meaningless events. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, Rachel's voice was shaky, nothing like the confident woman I remembered. She didn't waste time on pleasantries, diving straight into why she was calling. Apparently, she and Karen had still been seeing that guy, the same one I'd caught in my house. Not that they were dating, it was just about the sex. And then something happened that neither of them had planned for. Rachel explained that during one of their sessions, the condom had broken. Karen hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, a few months later, she was pregnant. Not just pregnant, 3 months along, and it turned out she was expecting twins. I leaned back in my chair, letting the news sink in. It wasn't that I felt sorry for Karen. I'd already washed my hands of her and her problems, but the irony of it all was too much. She had been so careful to maintain her perfect image, and now here she was, knocked up with twins from a guy who was only supposed to be a fling. Rachel went on to say that as soon as they found out, the guy had disappeared. He wasn't answering his phone, hadn't been to his usual hangouts, and neither she nor Karen could get in touch with him. He'd just up and vanished, leaving Karen to deal with the mess on her own. She wasn't asking for money, Rachel said, or for me to take Karen back. She knew that ship had sailed. But she was asking for my help to find this guy, to at least hold him accountable for what he'd done. As she spoke, I could hear the desperation in her voice. She wasn't just calling for Karen. She was calling because she didn't know what else to do. I listened, letting her get it all out. And when she was done, I took a deep breath and told her no. I told her that I was happy where I was, that the air was fresh, the weather was good, and I had no intention of spoiling it with memories of the past. I hung up before she could try to convince me otherwise. A couple of days later, I was out on one of my usual walks, taking in the scenery, when a car pulled up next to me on the road. I glanced over and recognized the driver, Karen's father. He and I had never gotten along particularly well. He was the kind of man who always thought he knew better than everyone else, and we'd butted heads more than a few times. Seeing him here was the last thing I expected. Karen stepped out of the passenger side, and I almost didn't recognize her. She wasn't wearing her usual makeup, and her bright, flashy clothes had been replaced with something more subdued. Her belly wasn't that noticeable yet, but I could tell she was trying to hide it. For a moment, I just stood there, taking in the sight of her. It was strange seeing her like this, so different from the woman I'd known for years. She walked up to me, her eyes pleading, and I could tell she was about to launch into her pitch. Her father stayed in the car, not bothering to get out. We'd never been close, and I wasn't surprised he didn't want to come inside. I didn't say anything as Karen followed me back to the house. I opened the door and let her in. My uncle was in the living room reading his newspaper, and he looked up when we walked in. He recognized Karen immediately and smiled, always the kind one in the family. He greeted her warmly, but Karen only managed a weak smile in return. We sat down in the kitchen and Karen began to talk. She repeated a lot of what Rachel had already told me, filling in the details about how the guy had disappeared and how she had no idea what to do now. She wasn't just asking for help, she was practically begging for it, saying she didn't know where else to turn. She asked me to help find the guy, to track him down, and make him take responsibility. I listened to her, let her say everything she needed to say, but my mind was already made up. When she finished, I simply looked at her and said, "No." She blinked like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She tried again, her voice wavering as she said I was the only one who could help, that I knew people who could find him, but I cut her off. I told her again, no. Karen's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't budge. She tried a few more times, each time more desperate than the last, but my answer didn't change. I wasn't going to get involved in this. I had moved on, and I wasn't about to let her drag me back into the chaos she had created. Finally, she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. She got up from the table, wiping at her eyes, and I followed her to the door. As she stepped outside, I held the door open and looked at her one last time. "Good luck, Karen," I said, my voice calm. "I hope you find happiness with your children." She didn't say anything, just nodded and walked back to the car. I watched as she got in and her father drove away. I stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle on the road, then closed the door behind me. In the month that followed, I never heard from Karen or Rachel again. I figured they were dealing with their mess in whatever way they could. I knew Karen would have her children in about 5 months, but that didn't change anything for me. Even if by some miracle I found it in myself to forgive her, I wouldn't go back. The children she was having weren't mine, and they'd always be strangers to me. That wasn't the life I wanted. The quiet, the simplicity, the serenity. It was all I needed. Lately, I've been thinking about renovating the house, making it more of a home. Maybe even finding someone, a devoted girlfriend, for instance, who could help take care of my uncle and share this life with me. There was no rush. I had all the time in the world. and for the first time in a long time, I was content.